Hello, everyone. Apologies that we're starting a couple of minutes past the hour. Wonderful to have you here. I'm Sally Davies, editor at Eon magazine, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's meetup on the ethics of humanitarian assistance. So today we're going to spend about an hour together. We might run a little bit over given we started late. So I'm first just going to say a few words to frame the discussion. Then I'll allow the panelists to introduce themselves and do some brief presentations, and then we're going to open things up for conversation and perhaps debate. So questions from all attendees are very welcome. I do invite you to use the Q&A to offer questions into the chat. We often can't pick them all up, but please do put them in there because they can inform the discussion. So it's now a little over a year since USAID was abruptly shut down and the world is still reckoning with the fallout. What began as a shock to the system has in fact settled into a slow unravelling as treatment programs are hollowed out and infrastructure is abandoned. Other high-income donors have begun quietly pulling back too, even as humanitarian needs continue to climb. The ethical questions go deeper than the immediate crisis, however. At a brochure meetup last year, the global health scholar Soji Adeyi challenged us to consider whether outrage over the USAID cuts implicitly defended a neo-colonial status quo that was itself deeply flawed. That critique forces us to hold two truths at once. The withdrawal of funding is causing real and measurable harm, yet the system that it disrupted is not what we should necessarily be fighting to restore. So within this crisis, today we can discuss perhaps the fact there is also an opening. If the old architecture was built on asymmetries between donors and the communities they claim to serve, then its fracturing may just create a space to ask who should hold power and the obligations that humanitarian actors truly owe to one another in a reimagined system. So three dimensions of this discussion seem to me to deserve particular attention. First is the ethics of abrupt closure. There's a world of difference between a managed transition and a sudden abandonment and the duties that arise when funders pull out overnight. Second is the hidden damage, not necessarily the headline grabbing program shutdowns, but the quieter erosion of quality control measures and supply chains that can be far harder to rebuild. And third, the fact what we're living through is not just a loss of financing, but a declining acceptance of the humanitarian sector itself, which raises what might be the hardest question of all. If the sector must justify its existence anew, whose voices should shape what it should become? So I'm going to start by asking each of the panelists to introduce themselves, and then I'm going to hand back over to the convener, Lisa, to just say a few words about the origins and motivations behind today's conversation. Lisa, would you like to start the introductions?
Hello everyone. I'm Lisa Eckenwiler, professor in philosophy at George Mason University, and a huge fan of the Brochet folks. So I'll just put that there. Thank you for that absolutely brilliant introduction, Sally. Do you want me to talk, or do you want to go around and have everyone introduce themselves before I do my opening words?
Look, why don't we take this moment to do, you've introduced yourself, so why don't you say the opening words and then we'll go around and
Okay.
introduce everyone else.
Terrific. Sorry if I missed the beat on that. So let me start by saying thanks to the team at Brochet, Laura, and the scientific committee, especially for welcoming the idea for this panel. I also have to say really most heartfelt thanks to Matthew Hunt and Lisa Schwartz, who I hope are here, not only for their leadership in this field of humanitarian ethics, humanitarian health ethics, and for the opportunity to work with them, but also for their help in thinking through this panel and who would be terrific participants. So I just want to acknowledge the role that they played in helping to organize this as well, and thank them again, for their work. So the origin story is this: like many of us, we were shocked with the swift shuttering of USAID about a year ago. And we're wondering about the immediate as well as the cascading effects, what this would mean for patients, for communities receiving assistance of various kinds, what it would mean for humanitarians, what it would mean for any gains that had been made by projects, what it would mean for the trend toward localization, which some of our work we think had helped to support. And then more generally, what was this going to mean for health equity? I should add that out of all of the research that we've done on the ethics of closing well, how do humanitarians plan for and leave ethically, the one thing we didn't look at were forced closures, abrupt shutdowns of programs. So like many of us, like many people, we were, although not to the same degree as people like Mayfourth and Raffaella, sort of reeling and trying to figure out what was the appropriate response. At the same time, reflecting on, or to capture back to what some of Sally had to say, we're really sympathetic to a lot of the critiques of humanitarianism and have been thinking a lot over time about what a new humanitarian sector would look like. And although this is not the reset that anyone would have hoped for, it does give us an opportunity to ask some questions. So, we're wondering, for example, that's my dog. What should be the organizing vision and the guiding principles of a new humanitarianism? What should guide the decisions about downsizing amid the many different kinds of crises that we have, hyper crises, protracted crises, neglected crises? Also, what kinds of ethical questions should we be asking as financing shifts and new kinds of partnerships are formed with new governments, also with the private sector, companies like Palantir, who have some very conflicting interests when it comes to the way their technologies are being deployed by the humanitarian sector and more militaristic interests. What should the future of governance look like in this new kind of ecosystem? And then, what, if any, structural reform should we be calling for? What should the new architecture look like? So while I suspect we're not going to get the reset we all might hope for, it is time to ask these questions and at least ask what we should be aspiring to. Because my sense is that rather than the ethical issues getting easier, they're much more complicated and difficult to resolve right now. So with that, I'll hand it over to the other panelists and just say how eager I am to hear what they have to say. Mayfourth has more stamina than anyone I've ever met and is one of the most inspiring, smartest people I've had the opportunity to work with. Samir, as I just said to him when we got started before you all joined us, wrote my favorite article of 2025 in Disasters. I'm going to forget the title, but something about the future of humanitarianism. And Raffaella, I just met for the first time this morning, but from all I've heard about her, I can hardly wait to hear what she has to say. So you're not going to hear very much from me. They're really the ones who are going to do the talking, led by the eminently capable Sally. But I want to say thanks for joining us and for caring about these issues.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Lisa. This would be a nice moment, I think. I'll just go around and have you each introduce yourselves. Mayfourth, can we start with you?
Hello, everyone. Good evening. I am Mayfourth Luneta from Center for Disaster Preparedness, also from Asian Disaster Reduction and Response Network. And I think that's it. I've been here in disaster risk reduction for more than 20 years. That's it.
Thank you so much, Mayfourth. Thank you so much, Mayfourth. Raffaella, can I bring you in at this point?
Thank you, and I'm very happy to be here today and to see some friends in the list of the participants. So my name is Raffaella Ravinetto. I'm a pharmacist by training. I'm currently a researcher and ethics reviewer. I work at the Institute of Tropical Medicine in Belgium, and my main job is being professor in pharmaceutical public health, which in fact means doing research and advocacy and education about access to medicines, which is very much related to the human right to health. But I am a former humanitarian worker. I worked for many years with Doctors Without Borders, and I was also the chair of the Ethics Review Board. And so being here for me is to some extent even personally emotional, because 25 years ago, as a young MSF pharmacist, I was helping to set up the antiretroviral program. That's where the first steps where we moved from 0 to 30 million people on antiretrovirals. So in the last year, we have seen the condition created to destroy all that work which was done. So I'm so happy that I can be here today and we can try to put these human rights violation issues at the center of the public attention.
Thank you so much, Raffaella. And Samir, would you like to come in now?
Sure. Okay. Well, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Samir. I'm the head of humanitarian policy at UNICEF. I've been here now for about a year and a half, and previously I was working with OCHA in a number of different crisis contexts in the Middle East, mainly, but also in Latin America. Also done some work, some research work with ODI and other academic institutions, and yeah, really look forward to this discussion. I mean, as others have said, this is really a critical and difficult moment for the humanitarian sector, and keen to hear and listen and contribute to see how we can move things forward in a more ethical and I think more effective way.
Thank you so much, Samir. Okay, I think we're going to start now by inviting Mayfourth and Raffaella to share their experiences of the past year, and then I think Samir is going to talk to us more about the future of humanitarian assistance. So Mayfourth, I'll just invite you to say a few words about your work, if you will.
Okay. Maybe we'll share about the ethical closure of a humanitarian project. That's our research that Lisa was referring to a while ago. We did this with McGill University, with Matthew, of course, and Lisa again, and the whole researchers, both young and mature, doing a lot of research on what do people, there is two parts. First, before they did it in the crisis context and humanitarian context, and not in Asia, but our part, we did it in Asia, and we did it in the usually mostly natural hazard context. And when we did that, the main goal is to what do communities see when the humanitarian work is done? How do they see the ethical closure of it? When the people will just give relief and they just go, or what for them is the ethical way? And of course, we've seen different principles through the research. We've consulted communities, other humanitarian actors, and almost all of them, the ethical closure would mean more on the respect, more on the respect, and more on doing no harm, and of course, making sure that the partnership goes on, not really real partnership with paper, but at least it will be closed well. All the components will be done, and there would be proper consultation and knowledge and proper awareness from the community, how it will be hold or how will it be done. So that's what we did. And when you ask the communities, actually our main goal, of course, is to make sure that the humanitarian actors would make very good ethical closure of all their projects, not thinking that the USAID thing will happen. So that's why when the USAID thing happened, the cut happened, our research became more relevant than the usual that we were thinking. And obviously, what happened was not ethical. But like I know that the medicine needed for those who had a lot of crisis in Africa or in other countries is very, very much needed. But in the Philippines, like for example, in our areas, we have at least 2,000 families, 2,000 families that are affected, which will no longer continue our disaster preparedness project because because of the closure. They're supposed to have a drill. They have their kits and everything to prepare for a flood. But now the cut has happened. the project was not completed. We did try to close it well, even if our partners did not close it well, just to make sure that the communities will be taken care of. Those things are very, very crucial, and also very, very polite when it comes to communities, that it's very crucial for their survival. And also what has happened now, because of the climate risk, we have hazard that has happened, like in a week there are 3 typhoon coming. So imagine the void that the cut happened, not only for the existing projects, but also during the humanitarian response that was not been given any attention to. So there is a big void in that. And so a lot of people that could have been helped, just like what I'm saying, that the 2,000 families that we work with, no more. So that's one example that I can give for now. Maybe when we do another round, I'm trying to keep my time, so others can also share.
Thank you so much, Mayfourth. I'd love to pick. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut across you.
Sorry. Maybe Matthew also, or Lisa, can add on to our research. But as I've recalled, I was interviewed by different news, and at the same time, our research itself was also highlighted in one of the articles because of this.
Thank you, Mayfourth. There's a few threads I'd definitely like to pull on there, but I'm going to return to you. I think at this point, I'm going to invite Raffaella to offer her perspective, sitting in quite a different location in this ecosystem of humanitarian aid, and then we'll close the presentations with Samir. So Raffaella, if you would.
Thank you, Sally. It was difficult to decide what to talk about because the situation is quite dramatic. So I would start my presentation or my reflection with the example of Guinea, which is one of the countries where we have some partnership, where a local colleague, Delphine Collier, has just spent some time trying to understand what's happening. It's interesting because Guinea didn't have a huge percentage of health activities supported by USAID, but still it was about 17%. You can estimate 70% of health activities were funded through USAID, with very key intervention in health security and in malaria. So we don't have clear data. It is estimated that the country has lost kind of 23 million of US dollars per year to health system support, and that the adjustment which have been tried this year were not planned. So the adjustments are there, but they are insufficient to absorb the shock, which is not surprising because, of course, this was not prepared upfront. So you have consequences which are obvious, that we can imagine. Firstly, and I really talking as a pharmacist, the medicines. Malaria is a disease which needs medicines for prevention and for treatment, and the supply chain has been disrupted with some concrete consequences, like the interruption of the malarian prevention chemotherapy. So in fact, there will be more cases because there is less prevention because the supply chain was disrupted. But then that's too easy, because it's not only about the medicine, it's about the health system infrastructures around the medicines. A lot of community-based activities have also been disrupted or interrupted, and that's those initiatives which are so important to go close to the patients, to go close to the community, and to facilitate the good health-seeking behavior, for instance. So that's also something which is disrupting the access of the persons to the medicines when it is needed. And there are much less community health workers, because if you have to save the money for buying the medicine, then you cannot pay the salary of the community health workers anymore. And that has an impact on the follow-up for the patients, but that's also another impact on very important things for the health system, like the data reporting. You need a community health worker to collect data and to send them at central level to guide the procurement, etc. So we don't have the medicines in a sufficient amount anymore, but all what has been built over years to bring the medicine to the community and to bring the data at central level has been disrupted. And malaria research activities have also often been discontinued. And yeah, malaria is not a disease which is close to elimination. You need ongoing research to understand the national features, the resistance, etc. So these are all things which are being disrupted. We know that USAID abrupt interruption is being kind of replaced by bilateral agreements which the US are negotiating individually with the different African countries. We will probably have the opportunity during the discussion to discuss about this disruption of multilateralism, which is not the best way to do pandemic preparedness and to ensure continental health security. But in this case, what I want to say about Guinea is that by interviewing healthcare staff and policymakers, they really say this negotiation of the MOU with the US government is a survival strategy. It's not a genuine partnership. They are struggling. You cannot increase the domestic co-financing to health sufficiently on such short period. So many countries are negotiating this bilateral agreement as a survival strategy, as Delphin and his colleagues wrote to me yesterday. So there is really a risk in the words of the Guinea healthcare workers that this is just exacerbating power imbalances, and the countries with limited negotiation capacity will be left more exposed. And just 1 minute more, now I'm talking about malaria. So the risk is that logically external counterparts and intervenants, NGO implementer will say, okay, let's help them not to lose the gains in malaria projects, which is fantastic. So, but malaria, TB, and antiretrovirals and HIV, these are things which are very important for health security. We have to stop infectious diseases. If we are thinking not in terms of health security, but if you are thinking in terms of human rights to health, then a number of people are being left behind. Non-communicable diseases. I mean, UNICEF was doing a great work to bring a momentum at UN level about non-communicable diseases. These people are going to be left behind because there will be a focus on health security. But if you are a young man with lymphoma in post-conflict Syria, or if you are diabetes patients in Cambodia, or if you have somebody with terminal cancer pain, you will be just left behind. So this is something that humanitarian has to now take into account in their operational priorities. They have to be more integrated than before. NGO has often being criticized because they were not integrating enough with the national system. This now really becomes even more important than before. Try to integrate with the health system and to support it. And try to think not only in terms of infectious diseases, but in terms of all the possible health problems which can cause human suffering. And then it becomes even more important to do advocacy and to use this information to advocate for multilateralism, to advocate for for universal health coverage, to advocate for health as a right of the person. So integration, prioritization of the most vulnerable, advocacy, it's not new, but it becomes even more urgent today in Guinea and in countries facing similar situation. And that's, yeah, all I wanted to say for now.
Thank you so much, Raffaella. That's I think really interesting in terms of building on what Mayfourth was saying. Samir, I'm now going to bring you in to sort of map out this landscape of new humanitarianism that we're entering into now.
Okay, no, thank you, and thank you, Mayfourth and Raffaella, for the interesting reflections and kind of showing how these impacts are how these cuts are having impacts very much on the front lines of different humanitarian response, and I think that's really been the struggle of this last year is to see the extent to which the impact has had on humanitarian operations across different crisis contexts, and many of the local organizations that we've been pushing for a long time to try to support and really emphasizing their role in core humanitarian response are often the ones that have been most affected because they don't have the capacity to absorb these cuts perhaps the same way that international organizations can or the UN can as well. Now, overall, this, this huge funding cuts from last year has really kind of pushed for a process of prioritization. So, the global humanitarian overview that was launched in December last year for 2026 focuses on 87 million people and has an ask of $23 billion. And it's really aiming to save as many lives as possible with the resources that are available. But to put that into perspective, the number of people in need for 2025 was 305 million people. So we're speaking about targeting less than 30% of the overall number of people in need. So that's a huge shift in the way that we do humanitarian response. I mean, there's always been a need to prioritize because, funding has never kept pace with the scale of the needs. But that means a much more strict focus on those geographic areas where people are most in need, particularly at the intersectoral level, which essentially means that they have needs maybe beyond one specific sector. So, we spoke a bit about the health sector or the nutrition sector, but this is really looking at it from an intersectoral perspective, looking at the populations that are most in need, for example, whether that be children or whether that be displaced populations, but also really reflecting on the type of interventions that we can actually provide. So just to give an example from a nutrition perspective, a lot of the work that UNICEF is doing now with this new funding environment is very much about treating severe cases of malnutrition. Now that's, from an overall programming perspective on nutrition, that's hugely problematic in the sense that we're no longer focusing as much on issues of prevention, on issues of focusing on moderate. And the risk is that people that are at the moderate level now will then fall into the severe without that support. So from an overall programming perspective, this focus on the most vulnerable and most severe, yes, it helps us save those immediate lives, but really puts in risk a larger population because we're not able to do that preventative work as well. And overall, within the humanitarian sector, there's a much more stricter definition of what do we mean by life-saving. So, for example, education in emergencies now is very difficult to argue is life-saving. But as we've seen, for example, in Gaza, that children that have gone 2 years without any education, formal education, the role that education plays now during the ceasefire is huge in terms of addressing issues of mental and psychological support and health of those children, addressing trauma, re-engaging in social relations, which is essential. But it's very difficult to argue that that's life-saving in the current environment. Furthermore, over the last couple of decades within the humanitarian sector, given that in many of these crisis contexts, the presence of development actors was quite limited, humanitarian assistance, especially when funding levels were relatively high, has tended to not just do immediate life-saving work, but has tended to also branch out into doing more resilience work, strengthening systems, doing livelihood support. And that role is incredibly important in addressing some of the chronic needs in many of these protracted crises, because we're talking about crises that have been going on sometimes for 2 decades, 3 decades. If you look at Sudan or if you look at the Democratic Republic of Congo, we're not just talking about, response to an earthquake or to tsunami or to a hurricane. So it's very much about how do we address these more protracted needs. But unfortunately, with these funding cuts, it's become much more difficult to argue the need to do that system strengthening that Raffaella was also talking about in terms of the health sector. And I think that's going to be a big loss for the humanitarian sector, because we still don't see sufficient development engagement in many of these crisis contexts. So a key, I think, ethical consideration that we need to bear in mind is that if we are talking about 300 million people in need, the humanitarian response plan, if fully funded, and that's a big question mark, will address 87 million people in need. Then what happens to the remaining 70% of that people in need that are not getting assistance? And it's not going to be through humanitarian response, but then what other mechanisms can we provide or can we support to support those populations? And that includes working with governments, that includes working with international financial institutions, but really trying to kind of, keep a spotlight on those broader needs and seeing how we can respond to them. I would say that, a key challenge is that the crisis that we're facing in humanitarianism is not just one of funding cuts, and I think it goes much deeper. And we've been speaking about reform for a long time in the humanitarian sector. I mean, if you take the report of the World Humanitarian Summit in 2016, many of the reforms that were outlined there are very much the same reforms that are being outlined now, no? In terms of how do we devolve power to local organizations, how do we promote greater accountability, and how do we make the humanitarian sector less centralized and less Western centric and become much more decentralized and more inclusive, across a range of different humanitarian response actors. And I think part of the challenge is that the humanitarian sector has very much grown over the last 3 decades because of the support that it's received from the kind of Western liberal kind of order that we've seen, which, if you're following, the conversations that are happening at Davos, at Munich Security Conference, very much in decline, saying, so if that liberal order is no longer there backing the type of system that we've seen over the last 3 decades, does this represent a real moment for actual change and for implementing those reforms that have been around for some time? And that really, I think, means around how do we make the humanitarian system more legitimate, more accepted, and more decentralized. And I think there's lots of questions now, in Europe, in North America, about the usefulness of aid, the fact that we should be focusing on domestic priorities and others. And I think there's a real need for the humanitarian sector to actually try to broaden the coalition of support for its humanitarian work, but also to engage the broader public as well. And I think for that, there needs to be some important changes. And one of those changes is really to maybe move away from the international system being the default implementer when there's a crisis, but more about being an enabler for other actors to respond, whether that be national governments, whether that be local authorities at the local level, whether that be local civil society, regional organizations. And by doing so, by providing global public goods. So, can we support them for example, access to supplies at a preferential rate? Can we work with the private sector to develop models around innovative financing? There's some interesting work that UNICEF has been doing with the private sector to provide, for example, insurance to communities before they get impacted by a disaster, and for them to take measures to be able to build their resilience before that disaster hits. So those are the types of activities I think that we can invest more on that can really help the system start to change and to start to shift. And I think key to that is how we look at issues of accountability. Now, the humanitarian sector has often I guess, marked its success by often counting how many people they've assisted, how much supplies have been delivered, and it's very output focused and hasn't been so good in actually explaining or giving a narrative or a story about what the impact we're having on people's lives. No? So rather than saying, for example, in Gaza, we distributed X amount of learning kits to children, is to actually talk about what impact having temporary learning centers in Gaza is having on children's ability to actually recover from 2 years of traumatic war, and being able to kind of re-engage in society and social relations, etc. I think that narrative that if we can better explain that narrative, I think we're going to be in a better position to kind of create a much broader coalition of support for the work that we do, and actually try to gain more support, because I don't think that we're going to be able to grow ourselves out of this crisis. I think the days of, huge amounts of funding coming through the humanitarian system from, European and Western donors is no longer going to happen. And I think we really need to take this moment to actually implement some of those reforms.
Thank you so much, Samir, and thanks to the panel. I think that there's a lot we can pick up on there. I think the first thing I guess I wanted to ask was to put to both Mayfourth and Raffaella some of the transformations that Samir is proposing and how the humanitarian ecosystem is going to work. Does that feel like do they feel workable to you in terms of where you sit on the front lines? Mayfourth, maybe I'll bring you in here to just get your reactions to a couple of Samir's proposals.
Of course, the suggestion, what it should look like, I agree definitely with Samir was saying. Now that we have bigger climate risks, more complex effect, the better the local actors should do more acting and do more work, and hopefully generate more resources on the ground. And I just remembered also when we have the ethical closure of how do we really close well, the principles that we are trying to see there, or the communities are also seeing that it is workable, is like you should have you should preserve relationships and promote fairness. There should be equitable partnership to make it work. Number two, it should be transparent and accountable. We should prevent harm and should sustain gains, and you should shift more on localization. The more direct funding there would be, the better, so that you would save more money, at the same time give direct funding to more solutions. And also, when you see to it, you were saying about humanitarian response, it is better to have a nexus of it. You're not only like trying to answer the immediate humanitarian response, but also connecting it with development, and also trying to reduce the risk itself. You also try to put money on how to prevent it, and so that it will not be repeated again. These things should be incorporated in your humanitarian response, and for that to be okay, there should be more participation of the local actors, and so that you will also be able to use resources very well. There should also be a complementation and collaboration at the local level. That's what we should do now, agreeing on the principle that Samir was also saying. See, so like for example, one last thing is that during the aid cut, what happened was big projects was ended very early, and the money that was not used, it could have gone to more preparedness, prevention part of it, and also at the same time the life-saving part of it could have gone to more people. But since it was cut, what your strategy should also be not only depending on the international donors, as Samir was saying, you should also look for local foundation or local resources that can be tapped, and also never downplay the resources that the people are putting into. One example is like when Mayfourth Luneta was saying, when we have the ethical closure of how do we really close well, there should be more participation of the local actors, and also when when there was no aid or coming in because the roads are not well and things like that. What happened was the community themselves within the area pulled in some food and tried to divide it amongst themselves. That's what happened in one area in the Philippines when there was a massive landslide and there was aid not coming in. So we should also consider the resources that there are there. Of course, that's not much, but we can work on that. That's for a bit so that others can also share.
Fascinating. Thank you. Raffaella, did you want to offer any remarks there?
Yeah, I mean, we could speak for the next week, probably. Perhaps 3 remarks. First, I fully agree on what Samir has presented, like Mayfourth, and I think this, to some extent, will probably accelerate the process of decolonization of global health and also decolonization of humanitarian intervention in global health. This was something which was already very much needed to shift and to share the power from a headquarters somewhere with the people in the field. This is becoming even more important these days. But with a bemol, with a clarification, in our group, sometimes we feel a little bit uncomfortable with the concept of resilience. Resilience is good, but it should not become an excuse for not to support enough. I'm originally from Italy. It's a very much earthquake hit country. When there is a earthquake, and it's quite common and often with very bad results, you watch the news, nobody talks about the need for the population to be resilient. Everybody talks about the right of the population to be supported immediately. So resilience is important, but we don't have to put everything on resilience because we end up to putting perhaps sometimes too much burden on the most vulnerable population. So just let me be careful with that. The second point is the autonomy of humanitarian actors in making their priorities. And this is not new. I mean, we have those who mainly depend on external donors. There are those NGOs which are more implementer of government funding. And that's becoming a problem because we start from USAID, but almost everybody, because of the geopolitical situation, is decreasing budget. France is just the last one. Yesterday, France announced the reduction of their contribution to the Global Fund of more than 50%. And there was before Japan and Canada and Belgium and everybody. So for implementers, it's becoming more difficult to compete for external funding. And there can be conditions which can be deemed unacceptable. The US, even when they keep on funding people now, they are restating these global gag rules, which would mean that NGO who want to benefit from funding, they have to accept that they will have to provide inadequate sexual reproductive health care and rights to comply with the US conditionality. So that's also a little bit complicated. For the NGOs, for the big NGOs, which have their own funds because they have a lot of funding from individuals, we will have to see whether this will continue or not in a world which is becoming much more fragmented, where people tend to think for themselves. And perhaps just the last point, the intervention in conflict areas. All what we are saying is becoming even more complicated in conflict areas. And this is something which should be somehow addressed. When we talk about vaccination policies, I see, for instance, vaccination, everything else. I've been reading a lot in recent year in humanitarian literature about the need to innovate. But I don't see how we can innovate in providing sustainable, high-quality care in conflict settings which are multiplying on this planet. So this should be somehow also be reprioritized.
Thank you so much, Raffaella. Okay, look, I'm going to just pick up on a couple of things that have emerged for me in the discussion. We've also got some very interesting questions coming through from the audience. So I think one thing that has emerged is this tension around the urgency of need and the particular pressure that is put on addressing the most vulnerable populations in a moment of constraint and scarcity versus the well-documented necessity to invest in prevention and, as you say, Mayfourth, to kind of look at humanitarian assistance through the wider lens of development. So I guess my question to the panel is, given that tension, which has become particularly pressing in the past year, how is it that those running programs and humanitarian actors can kind of make the case to direct resources to those longer term programs, given the additional pressure to help the most vulnerable? And I guess just to reflect back something that you said, Mayfourth, that might be part of an answer in your prior response, I heard you to be saying that actually local resourcing might actually be more organically responsive in terms of allocating resources appropriately across those two time horizons. But that was just me reflecting back something you said. So I'm just offering that up to the panel, kind of how is it that humanitarian actors can navigate that particular dilemma, that particular tension, which seems very pressing at this present historical moment?
Like for example, can I say? Yeah, for example, we had an earthquake recently, and of course, when it comes to earthquake, shelter is one big area of problem. So the immediate is temporary shelter. You can have like tarpaulins, just to cover the house, things like that, just to provide shelter for rain and then things like that. But at the same time, part of the research and the ethical closure, there's a strong suggestion that after the closure, there would be a action planning after the humanitarian response. So you would know what other intervention that can go towards recovery and then probably rehabilitation and things like that. So what happened was in one of the projects that we have seen is they do not only like provide shelter, but because it's big, the money is big when it comes to shelter. So what was provided was a training on how to make the houses resistant, earthquake resistant, so that in the coming humanitarian response for earthquake, at least there would be less problems, hopefully, if they build their houses better, something like that. So I think one investment for humanitarian response, when we do humanitarian response, there's always the thought of towards going recovery, meaning not only the basic food, shelter, things like that, but also trying to look into at least a livelihood, a bit of a livelihood always, so that it will become a bit more sustainable and hopefully addresses the root causes of the problem. There are, in the Philippines, you have flood, all these hazards that we are encountering. But one big problem is the vulnerability of the people. So it's a question of vulnerability. So when you do humanitarian response, we should always also think on how we reduce the vulnerabilities. We talk about resilience. I like that, Raffaella. You know what we are also exploring right now is resistance. Not resistance on revolution or something, but more of resistance because resilience is like when the wind hits you, you try to stand back again. That's resilience. But resistance is when the typhoon hits you, you are able to absorb the shock, meaning you are already resistant. And for us to do that, you should do more investment in development work and sustainable development, so that instead of people always evacuating when there is typhoon, what you will do is relocate them in a place that is more safer and build more safer things. And also, but make sure that there's livelihood so that it will be okay. Now, I'm okay always all the local resources being tapped and being explored, and more also to the underline in the equitable partnership. Of course, we all know that this is the one last thing that I would say. Yes, there is a cut in the different government agencies, the international government agencies that gives in different countries. But we have experienced two kinds of cut. I will not say which, but one is that the abrupt, with us not knowing how to handle it in the immediate, and we are forced to have our faces be saying sorry to our community partners with you see, and doing all the making up because the cut was abrupt. The other was another partner also had a cut, but what they did was they went through with us. They told us we'll be having a cut, that this will happen soon because of a lot of different things, politics and everything in their area. So we were informed earlier on, and then in solution, we tried to do it to make the solutions together. You see, I mean, everything, the funding is really all getting smaller and smaller. But the more we talk about it and you have equitable partnership and you consider the partners and the communities as equals, then it will be easier to accept if it is transparent and well informed and everything. It's easier to accept, even if the money is huge. But if you are going through the crisis together, it's easier rather than doing an abrupt thing and you are not consulted. You are not like, who are you? Anyway, we're just giving the money. I mean, I don't want to name names or things like that, but that's the point. I know you get what I'm saying. So we have still a lot of challenge that will happen soon because of the climate risks that we have, meaning more disasters, more challenges, more conflicts, and the goal that we have, that to reduce the risk for and also to make our humanitarian response better is or is yeah, escalating the challenge. Now, but again, as I'm saying, let's underline also the not only humanitarian response, but also the nexus. You try also to reduce the risk. Like, for example, when we say about health, let's also try to give a proper health care. The primary health care should be there so that you already reduce the risk by half. That's it. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think I'm going to bring it at this point. I'm just conscious, we've got so much ground to cover. I'm actually going to allow the meetup to run a bit over. I might even allow it to go sort of quarter past. I know that's stretching everyone's attention, but it's just such a huge and important area. I think it's important we give it enough space. I want to pick up on another aspect of this conversation, which is, I guess, the relationship of humanitarian ethics to the collapse of the liberal world order. I mean, Samir noted that the humanitarian system as we know it was built inside this particular political moment, the post-Cold War liberal international order, and that is manifestly crumbling around us. Now, Lisa opened the panel by mentioning sort of some of the actors in this new ecosystem that's emerging. We obviously have corporations like Palantir, but there are also, states that previously haven't been involved in humanitarian assistance to the same degree, such as Gulf states, China. So I'm curious to hear from the panel sort of how can humanitarian actors on the ground and in other parts of this ecosystem kind of work to avoid a new post-liberal equilibrium that may be troubling and suboptimal in ways that are different to the existing suboptimal previous equilibrium, if that makes sense. Do any of the panelists kind of want to step in on that question?
Maybe just to come in, and I think this is a really important one because I mean, also, change for the sake of change is not necessarily a good one. And we can see, obviously, we've seen some types of, humanitarianisms that are deeply problematic, such as like the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation in Palestine. But also, we've seen, private sector play a greater role, whether that be Fogbo in South Sudan and others. And there's questions around some of these fundamental principles and how do we ensure that we uphold them. And I think what's critical is like if we are going to move to a more decentralized way of humanitarianism, I think it's also recognizing that that humanitarianism doesn't need to look the same everywhere, and should be defined also by different contexts and different cultures and different situations, even if you have some underlying principles that that obviously should be maintained, including our obviously commitment to humanity, principles of impartiality, which are essential around providing needs to those most in need, but also being able to ensure that there's attention to those people that are affected by humanitarian crises. And I think there was a question attached about who defines who's in need, and that's very much around, well, the people themselves that are affected should be able to define what are their humanitarian needs. And I think that's why much more of a local approach is important. And I think by really supporting these decentralized forms of humanitarianism that are led from the regions or by different countries, working with governments, working with local civil society, etc., I think that you can then try to ensure that there's certain safeguards to make sure that these principles are adhered to, and therefore it's not in global capitals that are defining, what ultimately, the humanitarian should look like. And I think, this idea of having a much more networked humanitarianism, which looks different in different places, I think is probably something that's a positive, will better reflect local realities, and be much more in tune with, what affected people themselves are saying are their needs and what kind of support they would like in terms of addressing those as well.
I mean, Samir, I guess to press you on that, I guess what I was trying to get at with my question to some extent was, is there a risk that in a system that is notionally decentralized, that nonetheless you can get these actors that can work horizontally to acquire large degrees of influence? And are there things that humanitarian actors within that network can do so as to mitigate that risk and make sure that it remains a sort of truly decentralized, localized space, as opposed to malign actors coming in and kind of mobilizing local forces for their own agendas?
No, of course, and I think some of the advocacy that different humanitarian organizations globally have come around to say, for example, when the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation was set up, to say that this is not humanitarianism, and I think that type of coming together to better define and to say, what I mean, this is the challenge, because I mean, you can come together and define, okay, well, what is legitimate humanitarian action? But at the same time, that is a slippery slope to actually also excluding other forms of humanitarianism that might not be the same as, what an international NGO from Europe might look like, but still can be a legitimate form of humanitarian action, whether that be local communities, mobilizing, in the context of the Syria conflict. So, I think I do think there needs to be safeguards, especially when, you're looking at, many technological companies that are working with, weapons manufacturers, but are also looking to do work with humanitarian sector. I think, that's, very dangerous terrain. And I think that needs to be carefully managed. And that's where I think, when we talk about the international system being an enabler, it can also help put some guardrails in place that can kind of support kind of, local actors, can manage the way that private sector might be involved in some of these humanitarian activities. But, it also needs to be careful not to also kind of, build walls around, what a legitimate humanitarianism can actually look like, recognizing the differences that we might see in different contexts.
Raffaella, I sense you want to jump in here. So, I mean, I'll just to conclude this train of thought, it seems to me, Samir, the sort of the tension you're talking about here is the necessity to stay true to principle in this new landscape of humanitarianism that is emerging, whilst not foreclosing the possibility of creative implementations of different varieties of humanitarianism and new forms and new coalitions that necessarily need to be built. And that's quite a difficult ethical dance, but one that humanitarian actors will have to navigate. Raffaella, I sensed that you wanted to jump in there. Please do.
I was looking at a comment of Samia in the chat, and it's really a key point, because I think we generally agree on solutions that NGO, humanitarian, they really have to try to implement some big principle, that the principle of community engagement. It's difficult. You have to decline it by different contexts, but you have to collaborative partnership with local root organizations, with local researchers. We have to do that. Going a little bit far from purely quantitative indicators, because which are insufficient to explain the impact. But the issue is, are humanitarian actors still able to do it? I mean, I used to consider that NGOs have some characteristic in common with political parties and with churches. You start with a dreamer, you start with a big ideal, then you grow, and you are a rebel, and at a certain time point, you are not a rebel anymore, you are a church, you are NGO, you have a big structure, and you have to exist as such. So the question is, if humanitarian actors, which have sometimes grown into big international organization, which is structure with the philosophy, etc., they will be able to go back a little bit to the original idealistic strength that they had. Because if you want to do advocacy, you have to go advocacy altogether. If you take Gaza, does it make sense that each and every organization complain about current politics, or it should be done all together? Are you ready to really decrease your European headquarters in terms of buildings, of staff, etc., to decentralize? So this is a question mark. I don't have an answer to that. And sometimes, which is what is a little bit worrisome, that you can have people saying, yeah, but now we are professional. But being an idealistic organization is not against being professional. You can be very professional, very innovative, whatever, but keeping that original strength. Otherwise, you will be an implementer and not really a humanitarian who, at the end of the day, prioritize the right to health, the right to life of everybody. And this is I'm not blaming anybody, because this is a really difficult exercise in a human organization. But I think this is a big question mark from the humanitarian world in this period.
Raffaella, I wanted to pick up on a word you mentioned there, which you also mentioned in your presentation, which is innovation and being innovative. And you talked about the difficulties of innovation in the context of humanitarian interventions in conflict scenarios. Now, I know that Matthew Hunt and Lisa Schwartz, who I think might be here, some of their work on humanitarian innovation ethics has suggested the sector has already struggled to embed ethical reflection in innovation, even when things are relatively stable. So I'm curious to hear from the panel, sort of in this moment of crisis, how much genuine opening to innovation is there, as opposed to, and how can we avoid that sort of under the banner of innovation, we're not in fact kind of imposing solutions on communities instead of sort of actually co-creating innovative solutions from the ground up.
We in the Philippines, we have, and some partners we have in Asia, we have this community-led innovations. So the innovations is really a much needed strategy nowadays, because you have a problem this big, you have the resources this big, so you really have to innovate on how to match those things. But as you were saying, how will you do that without compromising some principles? We have talked with the communities wherein they are the ones doing the innovation with the resources that they have, and also trying to do compatible efforts in doing humanitarian work or in doing your innovation, so that like for example using technologies in making a call is also good. Makes it faster, but at the same time it should be feed upon by the communities so that it will be more realistic. So there should always be a check on how close it is with the community. Whatever innovation you're doing, there should always be a check on how it is how it is a reality in the community. So one suggestion is they themselves will be the one to innovate or lead the innovation in humanitarian work and other things. Yeah. And we have an example is this survivor community-led approach, wherein the survivor community-led response is that the communities are the ones planning the humanitarian response. Now, us, we're local NGOs, national NGOs. What we do is we just try to connect them with other international partners that can fund them or give a push to what they are already doing. They started with their own resources as well. So those strategies are also in a way in itself is already innovative. Yeah.
Building on this line of inquiry, Mayfourth, we have a question here coming from one of our audience members about the role of AI and how that might be transforming humanitarian interventions. I just wondered if you could share any concrete examples from your work, and Raffaella, likewise, curious to hear kind of in this context, and of course bearing in mind that some of these technology companies might in fact also be some of these new actors that we want to mobilize into new coalitions. What's happening on the ground right now in terms of how AI is transforming humanitarian assistance?
In our network, we have collaborated with some of partners who are doing mapping or any technological thing. I mean, and by doing that, we were able to map and digitize also part of it. Of course, AI can also come in. What I'm saying is I'm putting the whole banner of using technology in the humanitarian work, not only AI. It can be useful. Can be useful because if it is put in a dashboard wherein funders, donor partners can see it all at once, and then you can also share where you are and what you are doing and who has been helped already in that dashboard, and you would have a common platform. Then it is easy. It can help a lot. Okay, it can help a lot. But the danger is always is that if first in communities that has no no internet, there are still some areas like that. Second is that to make sure that the data that is coming from the ground really comes up. Because sometimes what they do, if you get data from AI, they will just do the desktop review of probable hit of families that are affected, but not the real actual numbers. So there should always be a check on it, and it's better if you have community partners that can validate those data. Hope it is helpful.
And
Absolutely, Raffaella.
If I can just add something, just very building on what Mayfourth was saying, you need data. AI will work if there are good data in the system. Otherwise, it will be a disaster. And what happened, one of the first consequences of the USAID withdrawal was that many DSS, many district surveillance systems were just collapsing because there were not more funding. So right now, I would say that the priority would be to restore the data collection system, the DSS everywhere, and then you can build with AI or whatever. Otherwise, you will have biased data or insufficient data, which will help to perpetuate injustice and even misinformation. So, but the data, the issue of data collection is really something which was dramatically affected by the USAID withdrawal in first place.
Lisa, I think you have a hand raised and want to come in there.
Just a quick point, and it sort of circles back to the point we were making earlier. If we're thinking about innovation, yes, let's talk about technology. But part of what worries me, not just the complexities of the tech companies and their interests, which are, profit, but also, is there not a lot more kind of like low-hanging fruit that's much less expensive in the way of innovation? I mean, Mayfourth is talking about building materials that enable people to withstand, typhoons. So it seems to me this is a really important area for innovation, and creating the kinds of things Samir is talking about, like global public goods that really reduce vulnerability, a lot of the constructed vulnerability that people face, right? So like one of the ways to save money on emergency response is to improve people's shelter and accommodations, their housing, right? Like, so that's something that if we do on a big scale isn't tremendously expensive, like expanding the use of AI will be, and could diminish the need for rescuing people using humanitarian resources over time. So that's what I'm really interested in, is innovation that helps diminish the socially constructed vulnerability that humanitarians have, responded to. And in some ways that's been part of the critique, right? It's enabled them to perpetuate power imbalances, because they're always there to rescue people. So how about innovation that reduces vulnerability?
Yeah. I agree with Lisa on that. The one I was sharing a while ago, the community-led innovation. One community-led innovation deals with a lot of actually community-led innovation that we had deals with indigenous knowledge. So problem is their problem is health access. So what the women did was their innovation is bringing the health services in the homes or nearby the center, wherein they used herbs and also try to processing herbs so that it can be available even during emergencies, producing soap that is very cost effective, cost efficient. The resources are there and very also they are being used naturally by the people around. So people already know it. And rather than waiting for synthetic drugs that has a lot of side effects at the same time, so expensive that sometimes it doesn't reach them on time. So that's one innovation that they had. The women were the ones who had studies on how to prepare the herbs and everything. And so when disaster strike, they were able to respond not only in their area but in the nearby community. And not only in the nearby community, there was this wedding. There was this wedding, and they had food poisoning. So what they did was they were able to give some first aid using herbs that can help remove the poison. So those things. You use local materials and local knowledge. Thank you.
It's fascinating to have that texture. I'm just conscious that we are probably going to have to wind up. I do apologize. I feel that we, in a way, barely skimmed the surface. I suppose I just wanted to close out by asking each of the panelists, I suppose, to respond to a kind of broad question, which is that if we were going to design a humanitarian system from scratch today, what are the one or two features of this reformed system that each of you would fight the hardest for? Maybe another way to ask this question is kind of, if you were advising a new generation of humanitarian leaders, what would you tell them the organizing vision of this humanitarian system should be? What should be the one or two features that you think should be the real priority?
Okay, I'll start.
Yeah. Oh, Lisa, let's go through the whole panel as a
And I'll be really
closing
fast.
exercise.
Epistemic justice, what we've been talking about here, right? Like respect for locals as credible sources of knowledge, and who should be leaders. And the second sort of guiding principle, I think, would be, and I'm gonna maybe tip my hat to Samir here, although I think in these terms myself a lot, sort of like ecosystem thinking, right? And like thinking about what are the relevant intersections among all of the various actors, and where are the strengths and vulnerabilities, you know, and whether that's funding, decision making, values, and okay, a third thing, back to what Samir said about accountability. So we can lament the demise of the liberal order, but if we're all candid, and I think we all are here, we're very clear on the fact that that order, right, was deeply fraught and really structured around inequities in power. So perhaps what's the best opportunity in all of this is that we're no longer kidding ourselves about what guiding principles, the tension with the guiding principles that we say that we're here to uphold. And so I think if what we can do is be more accountable and say, these are the ways that we are or we're not promoting health justice. These are the ways that we are or we're not respecting local knowledge. And just being more candid and aware of that, rather than romanticizing the work of humanitarianism, which I think has been one of our flaws over the last several years. And if we're dealing with actors who are very clear, have complex interests, technology companies or Gulf states, then maybe it's going to be a little bit easier to identify what some of the ethical fault lines will be.
Thank you so much, Lisa. That's a wonderful rallying cry, I suppose. Samir, would you like to come in with the one or two principles? You may find yourself repeating what you've already said to some extent, but the one or two principles that you think are sort of really crucial for us to bear in mind as we kind of navigate this new post-liberal reality.
No, I mean, I think for me, it's more around how do we move away from a model of, humanitarian organizations essentially trying to grow. The kind of key marker of success for many humanitarian organizations is how much more fundraising they can do, to actually around how can you actually enable others to respond. And I think that's a radical shift in thinking about, what is the role for international humanitarian organizations. And I think it's really around moving away. And I think someone in the chat had used the word paternalism, a kind of like, moving away of trying to define, what the best humanitarian responses are, but really working with local actors, whether that be communities, whether that be governments, whether that be local private sector, and really trying to enable them to be able to provide the best response that they see. And it's not necessarily romanticizing kind of everything that's coming from a local level is necessarily a positive thing. And I think, there's international standards, there's guardrails, there's quality assurance, there's normative roles that international organizations can play. But I think it's really about rethinking what their role is within the system, moving away from being a default implementer in all of these crises, but actually how do we facilitate the roles of others? And maybe there'll be some exceptions, like in the big crises where there's a lack of political will or no national capacity to respond, that international actors will play a greater role. But I think that shouldn't be the default way of working in many crises.
Thank you so much, Samir. That's incredibly clear and helpful. Mayfourth, do you want to come in with some concluding remarks, the kind of one or two principles that you would want this kind of idealized designer of the new humanitarian world order to bear in mind?
Well, dito to what they have already said, and there's a lot that they've said already, but I guess for us, locally led solution should always be supported, meaning my bias, of course, is the community themselves. You should revolve on that first. How to support them, or how to strengthen existing capacities that they have, And then we now call it capacity sharing, and then give a highlight on what they have already been doing, and as you were saying, support the ecosystem of this, like this thing, that the communities will be at the forefront, local actors should be there, of course, together with the government. We should never remove the role of the government. We should always remind them their role, so that because sometimes we feel that some government are not doing their roles, so that's why we'll do it better. Well, they should still do their roles better, but we will just help in making this work. So equitable partnership, at the same time, capacity sharing, and of course, locally led solution. All also in the spirit of humanitarian work and nexus of development, DRR, and humanitarian work, and also peace. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mayfourth. And Raffaella.
Well, building on what has already been said is now a challenge. But I think one thing is really going away, it has been said, from paternalist, going away from that kind of interventionalist things. I come, I intervene, and I left, and I leave. It's difficult, but humanitarian intervention should include a not exit strategy. We used to say exit strategy, but it's a terrible word, a follow-up strategy. So, and to do so, it should be integrated as much as possible, or as early as possible, with the local infrastructure, with the local system, whether health system, education system. So this integration, it's really something that should become central, even if it was not for obvious reason in the 70s, but we are not in the 70s anymore. Second is the critical thinking and contextualization. Put yourself constantly in questions. Listen to the local community. What is needed? We never did palliative care in humanitarian intervention. Well, we should do it. We can call this innovation. We can call it something else, but we didn't do it before. Let's do it now because it is a need. So this capacity to constantly rethinking rather than applying the same protocol. And the last, it's a recommendation. It's a bit stupid. I could mention a lot of ethics principles which are very important, but we said, really do not stop dreaming. When I hear somebody who is a humanitarian worker and who said me, no, we cannot do that because we wouldn't have the needed level of quality. Okay, let's try to come to a compromise between quality assurance, innovation, etc., but which are the need. Let's dare a little bit more. We need to dare a little bit more than what common sense would dictate us to do. That's what I would tell.
Thank you so much, everyone. Well, look, I'm going to wind us up there. I wanted to extend our thanks to the Foundation for this conversation, to Mayfourth, Raffaella, Samir, and Lisa, as well as Matthew Hunt and Lisa Schwartz for their contributions to the thinking behind today's meetup. I think for me, if I was to distill what I've heard today into a single shift, I think it's really about the implications of this notion that the international system needs to move from a position of kind of doing, even the word intervention is perhaps a bit of a misnomer here, to enabling. I mean, this is something that Samir named explicitly, but I think we've also heard Mayfourth describe in terms of communities planning their own response, innovating with local materials and dividing food among themselves. So to some extent, the infrastructure for this shift is there, and it's a question of kind of what can be done to support it and channel resources towards it. And a phrase that Lisa used, I think, will also stay with me, that perhaps the best opportunity in this crisis that we're living through is that we're no longer kidding ourselves, and that the liberal order that built this system was fraught and structured around inequities of power. And if that pretense of neutrality can now be exposed, perhaps in all of this, there can be some fresh forms of accountability in the humanitarian equilibrium that will now evolve. So thank you all for your generosity, your candor, and the conversation. It's been a pleasure to be here, and thanks again to the Foundation for holding the space for these important discussions.
Thanks for leading us in the discussion, Sally. We really appreciate it. And thanks to Mayfourth for staying up so late. Oof.
Thank you. No
Thank-
worries. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you so
Everyone.
much.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Sally. Thank you,
Bye-bye.
everyone. Samir, Raffaella. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you.
Thank you.